there's going to come a point where the Chinese militarization and China's military advances are going to stall, and gains are going to almost be reversed in light of American technical superiority. So China know they're on a time frame, and every year will matter, every year will count. And when we can see great geopolitical issues like Ukraine and Israel and Gaza distracting American political and military attention, it's only going to be a matter of time if Xi Jinping decides to strike.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen, and today we're speaking to Robert Clark about the growing threat of escalation around the world. Robert is the Director of Defence and Security at Civitas. He also served with the British Army for 15 years, including deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Robert, thank you so much for joining us on Frontline today.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It does feel like we're in a particularly dangerous situation at the moment globally in terms of the risk of escalation. Obviously, we have the ongoing situation in the Middle East. The war in Ukraine continues. And you've been writing recently about the ongoing threat of a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Just sum up, if you can, Robert, how much of a threat you think the world is at in terms of escalation currently.
Sure. I mean, if we don't focus too much on the Taiwan-China issue at the minute, the escalation in the Middle East has both immediate and profound possibilities and consequences for British national security going forward for the next 10 years. We can already see that the US administration, the Biden administration's overriding priority at the moment isn't necessarily the support of its ally Israel or the humanitarian relief effort for Palestinians in Gaza. It's the ability to contain this conflict purely within Israel and the Gazan borders, so it doesn't escalate. Because if it does, it will undoubtedly bring in the US military in an overt manner, which will almost automatically trigger the likes of Iran and Iranian proxies across the Middle East. And obviously, if the US become embroiled further, then the US will look increasingly to the UK and other partnered allies to help as well. We already have forces in the region. We've got 2 British sovereign territorial bases in Cyprus, only about 30 minutes airtime away from Israel. And we have assets in the Mediterranean Sea already. So the ability for this to escalate really does have profound possibilities and consequences.
Do you think that the American strategy of trying to contain the situation is working so far?
Undoubtedly, it is working so far. As with all conflicts, but this one in particular, it's evolving at such a pace that's why the threat of escalation is very high for miscommunication, misunderstanding through various actors in the region. But it's been contained so far. The diplomatic effort by the Biden administration is absolutely phenomenal, to be perfectly honest to them. The diplomatic effort that they've seen engaging with partners across the Middle East, the State Department has been undertaking many meetings across many regional partners, just to name but a few. Obviously, the regional powers like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Qatar, Dubai, these have all played instrumental parts so far in trying to contain this from escalating even further. But it's by no means going to be an easy task to continue this going forward.
It's interesting that you have praise for the Biden administration and the way they've handled this in recent weeks, because obviously 2 years ago they received a lot of criticism because of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and how that played out. Do you think 2 years on, this is a far better approach which they're taking to the Middle East at the moment?
Oh, undoubtedly, and they would have undoubtedly learned the lessons, the diplomatic sort of pitfalls that they were encountered with the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and crucially how that withdrawal was handled. But in terms of the Biden administration over the last few years, it's been absolutely, whilst I may sort of welcome its recent developments with Israel and Gaza and the Palestinian authorities, really the last few years have been an abysmal track record for the Biden administration with regarding its Iran policy and the renewed efforts for the JCPOA, the so-called Iranian nuclear deal. This resulted only in a few weeks ago with the release of around $6 billion of frozen assets for the Iranian regime. That's now been paused because of Iran's suspected, almost undoubted role in the current crisis. But that's the position that we got to, or that's the position that the American administration had got to, which was an almost appeasement of the Iranian regime. And they're well known for obviously causing widespread and far-reaching, political instability and terrorist actions across the Middle East. So the last few years have been incredibly difficult for the Biden administration publicly. And it's interesting to note, to back this up, we can actually see the Biden administration's very, very muted response, the initial responses after the Hamas atrocities on the 7th of October, because obviously it drew undoubted sort of links and direct lines of failed diplomacy regarding the Iranian nuclear deal. But no, within the last few weeks, the diplomatic effort by the Americans to try and pull in regional partners, engage, communicate, and in particular, where we've seen real progress with that is with the Egyptians, who have been incredibly quiet over the role that the Egyptian border crossing at Rafah, which we've seen reopened over the last 24 to 48 hours. That's been a lot of American heavy lifting behind closed doors. So it is working, but going forward, it's going to be incredibly difficult to sustain that without slips.
Well, quite. I mean, it's working so far. If the situation in the Middle East did escalate, how would you see that playing out, Robert?
So one of the biggest problems for American policymakers, if you like, and with that counterparts in London, is obviously the emergence of Iran more directly into this conflict. So whilst we know obviously they fund and organise not just Hamas, but in particular Hezbollah to the north in Lebanon, which is a separate issue altogether. If Iran become much more directly involved through escalation, the ability for Iran to close the incredibly critical and vulnerable Straits of Hormuz, in which around a third to half of all global oil flows transit, then that not only damages American national security and the American global economy, but also Saudi Arabia critically as well. So these are all incredibly fragile relationships at the state level. And that's not to mention, like I say, at the sub-state level, such as like obviously the role of Hamas in particular, but also Hezbollah. And really we can see the effect of Hezbollah drawing in Israel to a second front in the north, diverting Israeli military attention away from Gaza to have a really negative effect and draw out the conflict, which will only make it worse ultimately for the Palestinians going forwards.
And how likely do you think that is?
The escalation itself.
Hmm.
I mean, look, we can already see it escalating, sort of on a more minor level. So with the northern Israeli border with Lebanon, around about 20 kilometers south of that border into Israel has been evacuated already by Israeli civilians because they know what's coming, which is increased border skirmishes with Hezbollah from Lebanon, and increased missile and rocket strikes coming from South Lebanon into Israel. So that's already happening. We're already at that escalation phase. The question really is how much of an effect can not just the American administration, but interestingly, increasingly regional powers like Egypt, Saudi Arabia in particular, even Jordan can have in reining them back. But ultimately, as a sort of word of sort of trepidation and caution, it's really, I wouldn't say it's pointless, but we have to look at the role of Iran and the ability to sort of deter Iranian escalation. So that's going to be incredibly important, and it isn't always a sure-gone conclusion. The ability to control the Iranian regime is notoriously difficult, particularly when they are fundamentally hell-bent on the destruction of Israel, just like Hamas are. So the ability to deter that from escalating is incredibly difficult.
Well, this is a key point. How best to deter Iran? You may want to try and contain the situation as the Americans are at the moment, but if you're seen to be doing that because you're afraid of the threat posed by Iran, that in itself has many risks.
No, absolutely. The absolute worst thing to do with a regime like Iran is not just appeasement, but to show weakness. If you look at, and again, I use historical examples, historically, when there's been flashpoints in the Arabian Gulf to do with Iranian and American security issues, whenever America showed strength and deterrence through force and military projection, the Iranian regime backed down almost instantly because they know fundamentally they cannot risk getting involved head on with a military escalation with the US forces. So at times like this, when there is Iranian military escalation, both indirect through proxies and directly through, for example, the IRGC, then America must show signs of strength. And like I say, historically, they're quite good at that. It's being able to understand and appreciate when that must be used. So, for example, the Pentagon is sending around about 400 additional US military um, uh, soldiers and airmen and sailors to the region to increase security throughout the region. But really, that's a drop in the ocean. America maintains about 40,000 military personnel across at least 9 or 10 Middle Eastern countries. So the ability to beef up that presence dramatically will be important going forwards. And this is all increasing pressure on not just the military machine, but obviously the Biden administration at a politically incredibly sensitive time.
Hypothetically, then, Robert, let's say this does escalate further. It becomes more of a regional conflict with Iran more formally involved and the Americans forced to react. What does Xi Jinping do? Does he see it as an opportunity to take Taiwan?
I mean, it's absolutely a consideration. Look, there's plenty of us who have been warning of the increasing motives behind the Beijing regime regarding its, the unification of Taiwan with mainland China. It fits into Xi Jinping's sort of narrative of Chinese rejuvenation. He has these set criteria and these set goals to achieve by pretty rigid timeframes. And like I say, the unification with Taiwan is absolutely fundamental to Xi Jinping's legacy. The question is, at what time is that best sort of suitable for geopolitical factors? Obviously, the war in Ukraine has played a humongous role in Chinese thought leadership and risk calculation regarding any sort of overt military action with Taiwan. Taiwan is still very, very far away politically from any sort of peaceful unification with the mainland. That seems further and further away, which increases the likelihood of military escalation by Beijing. So, whilst the US becomes potentially increasingly drawn to Israel and the Middle East, particularly across multiple Middle Eastern fronts, then it absolutely raises the escalation potential for China sending overt military force to Taiwan. Obviously, like a blockade by sea, an air blockade, and then ultimately potentially an invasion itself. As costly as that undoubtedly will be for the Chinese, it is something that Xi Jinping is absolutely set on at some point. And like I say, the closer we can see the US becoming entangled and distracted, both militarily and particularly politically, away from the Pacific, it does raise the odds considerably for that to happen.
I suppose the counter argument would be that when Putin launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine at the start of last year, there were people saying, is Xi Jinping going to move on Taiwan now because the West is distracted? That didn't happen. In fact, you could argue the strength of the Western response maybe deterred Xi Jinping. Do you think that still applies, or do you think if there was a second front, if the US were also actively involved in the Middle East, trying to de-escalate a conflict potentially with Iran, then that would go out the window and Xi would seize his opportunity?
I do think it increases the likelihood if America become more militarily and politically committed and distracted with the Middle East, which it can't afford not to be doing at the minute. It's fundamental to American security with both the oil flows and the natural resources, but also it has heavy committed defense agreements and partnerships with key Middle Eastern allies, none less than Israel. So it can't not be involved politically and militarily with the Middle East. But like you mentioned with the war in Ukraine, and sort of the collective international, well, more the collective Western response to both supporting Ukraine and trying to deter Russia, that would have had a huge play in Xi's calculus on Taiwan. Nobody has been watching the war in Ukraine more so than the Chinese for the Western response, which will obviously factor into their threat perception with Taiwan going forwards. It's going to be an incredibly difficult balancing act for the Americans for the next 12 months during election season as well and campaigning, where we've got a war in Europe with no real end in sight. We've got now a brewing war in the Middle East with one of America's key allies in the world. And yet we've got the Chinese provocation in the Indo-Pacific, which is increasingly important to America for economic and political reasons. It's got first and foremost, it's got a treaty-bound defense agreement with the Philippines, which are coming under increasing harassment by the Chinese PLA Navy, and obviously its lesser ally Taiwan. It's not really committed specifically to hard defense of Taiwan like it is implied with the Philippines, but undoubtedly going forwards, the increased likelihood of military escalation in the Pacific with China, with either the Philippines or Taiwan, will undoubtedly bring America into the fold again. So it's almost we're seeing a situation now, very unusually, where America is going to be committed quite seriously in potentially three fronts. Obviously, Europe financially, the Middle East potentially militarily, and now in the Indo-Pacific as well within the next few years. So it's an incredibly difficult time for American policymakers.
And what response do you think, let's say China launches an invasion of Taiwan and tries to take it? What response do you think we would see from America? Joe Biden in the past has been very, very strong on this, suggesting they would respond even militarily. But do you really think that would happen?
I mean, it would depend on the nature of the Chinese incursion. There's obviously several stages and there's several sort of scenarios. The most likely, the first stage, if it was a direct overt military offensive by China, would be the blockade by sea. Now that would happen of Taiwan. Sorry, now that would happen very very quickly. The ability for U.S. forces in the region to respond to that would be both limited and potentially not much effect. Therefore, they raised the military escalation by America to actually break the blockade of Taiwan by its navy, just like we would see in the Strait of Hormuz if Iran chose to close that with its navy and the IRGC navy. So straight away we have direct military confrontation at sea. Then we have the air campaign. Now America's Air Force is situated across many different bases in the Pacific, all within several hours flight time to Taiwan and the Taiwan Straits. But like we're discussing, air sort of superiority at the first instance by China. America would have to do a lot to sort of reverse that. But the ability for America to really break that sort of ring of steel across Taiwan would result in untold sort of American casualties. It would be incredibly difficult to fight, and that's without talking about other external factors, underwater sea capabilities, submarine warfare, electronic warfare, and obviously China's advanced hypersonic missile program. So it really is the most difficult circumstance for which American policymakers will undoubtedly be planning for. And like I say, this will be even more difficult with America becoming more encroached in the Middle East going forwards. I think for the next 12 months, certainly we can see the American military presence in the Middle East becoming more and more engaging. And like with that increases the risk with China. Look, Xi knows he's on a time limit with Taiwan. There's going to come a point where the Chinese militarization and China's military advances are going to stall, and gains are going to almost be reversed in light of American technical superiority. So China know they're on a time frame, and every year will matter, every year will count, and when we can see great geopolitical issues like Ukraine and Israel and Gaza distracting American political and military attention, it's only going to be a matter of time if Xi Jinping decides to strike.
What do you think his time frame is to take Taiwan?
I mean, it's been publicly stated several times that the U.S. intelligence committee intelligence community believe is going to be certainly by the end of this decade, by 2030. That's when the Chinese military, the PLA, have been sort of warned off that they must achieve, military compatibility with America. So the moment the PLA, the Chinese military, achieve rough peer sort of status with American military by the end of this decade, then America are going to be absolutely on the back foot in terms of trying to, retake Taiwan or support Taiwan from a Chinese military offensive. So that leaves us around 6 years or so to play with in terms of the ability to deter China away from that. So over the next sort of 4 or 5 years are going to be incredibly key. And that's why issues like Ukraine and now with Israel and Gaza, these aren't short-term issues. These are going to be over the next, 24 to 36 months, dominating the geopolitical flashpoints with America. So that's why this is all coming at an increasingly, fragile and vulnerable time for global security.
Just on China, Robert, I've seen a lot of discussion recently about the fact their economy is not doing as well as it was and what effect that may have on Xi Jinping's thinking. And I've heard some commentators say, even though it may sound counterintuitive, it probably increases the likelihood of some kind of move on Taiwan because he will need a distraction in the same way that Putin, despite the economic woes they have in Russia, felt he needed to have some kind of military victory.
Sure, I wouldn't say so much it's a case of trying to strike as a distraction to appease a domestic audience. If we consider the role of the Chinese state, media and the police state, Xi Jinping doesn't really need to appease or gain the popular support of the Chinese people in a way that even President Putin does in Russia with the Russian people. It's a very different set of socio circumstances. But the idea, the theory that Xi Jinping may strike or China may strike sooner rather than later, absolutely is a credible one. I would go so far as to say it's highly likely, purely because we have the instance of America being engaged elsewhere, increasingly drawn elsewhere politically, and in addition, like I say, China are on a time frame, so they will want to strike. They won't want to leave it until the last safe moment. They will want to strike when they know they're at their strongest. And ultimately, with American technological superiority still being somewhat as it is, the time is running out for Xi Jinping. He hasn't got forever.
Just finally, Robert, were this to happen, were there to be an escalation in both the Middle East and then in China and Taiwan, what would that mean for Western support for Ukraine? Would that be the first thing to go, potentially, politically?
Yeah, sure. No, we've already seen it not go, obviously, but we've already seen it reduce in America already over the last 2 weeks. So later on today, in the U.S. Senate, they're arguing for the funding for Israel. I believe around $14 billion thereabouts is going to be signed off for almost immediate release to support Israel militarily. That's going to be at the expense of aid and military equipment that would have been in the pipeline for Ukraine. We've already seen American missiles go not just to Israel, but to Middle Eastern partners to help with the air defense systems against Iranian proxies that were originally designed to be going to Ukraine. So we can already see the trickle feed of military aid and money that was originally earmarked for Ukraine already getting ciphered out and going to the Middle East. So the longer this goes on with Israel, the longer Israel's war goes on, the more damaging, far more damaging it will be for Ukraine. And this is, like I say, we're about to hit campaign season and the election year next year. I know for a fact if the Republicans return to the White House, then their support for Ukraine will diminish even further. That the expectance that Europe will be obliged to pick up a lot more of the the heavy lifting for military support for Ukraine going forwards. Now that frees up, obviously, the counterpoint. It frees up American military infrastructure and aid for the Middle East and for in the Pacific. But yeah, no, absolutely. The longer this goes on, the more damaging it is for Ukraine. Absolutely.
Robert Clark, thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.